has extensive background in agile testing and agile development practices, and as well as performance engineering. He's been in the software industry in one facet or another for over 22 years. It's a passion for helping teams and leading transformations within organizations, and in helping organizations and teams adopt lighter ways to develop software. I think this is definitely a subject that interests all of us as professionals in testing, because we're constantly hearing shift left, lighter, quicker, faster, as our organizations that we work for are pushing us to push product out as soon as possible, with, of course, zero defects. So, Robert's going to be presenting this afternoon around continuous testing using smaller feedback loops, continuous delivery, gaining serious momentum, and a delivery practice to close 65% of organizations in the 7th stage of adoption. Feedback loops and approaches are extremely important. Layers of automation are important. The CI world is important. And Robert is here to kind of tell you, well, is here to tell you, how he's adopted it, what he practices, what he sees, and to give you some practical feedback from his experiences. So if you would all welcome Robert Shaw.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Matt mentioned I'm a local guy. Born and raised in Philadelphia, have lived here for 40-some years, have worked in and out of companies around the local area almost that entire time. 22 plus years in software development, most of that in the QA and the testing space. I think when it gets down to it, I've done other jobs, I've managed development teams, I've just played a variety of other roles, and I think what it gets down to is I'm a tester at heart. I like testing these things. I like figuring out how things work. I like experimenting. I like that whole process of testing. I just love everything there is about it. So when I'm talking today, I'm talking about continuous testing inside of continuous delivery. And it's one of those things where you're starting to hear more and more buzz around it. And kind of hopefully we can go through and unpack a little bit of a mindset, a little bit of an approach of how to start, one, kind of organizing and approaching a solution for it. So, a little bit about what this talk's on. It's a discussion on continuous delivery. It's not a how I solve world peace using a specific tool. So that's something that we're seeing as continuous delivery gains more momentum. Inbox spam. Buy our tool, buy our software, one-stop shopping, all the automation needs you could ever want from continuous delivery. Not going there. It's more of a mindset on a possible approach for solutioning. When we first started the frontline tackling this problem, we got very overwhelmed very quick because we're doing this, okay, what is it? There's all these moving pieces, and do we buy these tools or that tools, or who's doing what, and the information, even not just Googling it, is you don't read the same article twice. I mean, there's all these different possibilities. And what we really had to hunker down is kind of come up with, like, what was a framework, what was a mental approach for trying to solve this? What was something that I could emotionalize or humanize continuous delivery to, or testing down to? I'm going to say this up front. We're not going to cover everything about CD. This thing is huge. Continuous delivery, continuous integration. There are so many facets and variables depending on what your organization is doing, what your individual software is doing, what your products look like, what your teams look like, what your structure looks like. We're just not going to get to it. Which leads me to interactive. If there's something you need to know, raise your hand, call out. I'd actually prefer to have a discussion than stand up here and talk for 40 minutes. Get involved. This is also the first time I'm presenting this topic in this format to a larger audience outside of Frontline. So your feedback, your questions are going to help drive and craft what this presentation really becomes. And it's really, really important because I need to know, which way to start taking this thing. All right. So 65% of developers, managers, and executives are heading down some path of starting to look at continuous delivery. Just a quick show of hands, just in this room, and how many people are working on a project where continuous delivery is on the roadmap? All right. Just if you're an agile team, just. All right. Is there anybody not on an agile team doing continuous delivery? I'm real curious. Okay. So that was roughly about 65% of the room. Has anybody solved it yet? Okay. Yeah, we got a sort of. Okay. So where's that 65% come from? It's actually surprisingly being driven at the executive and manager levels. I've never seen awareness of a particular discipline or approach at that high at the executive level. Even within frontline, you hear some of our people at the C level and the executive level go, oh, we're doing continuous delivery. Where are we in continuous integration? When you start attending seminars and you go to conferences and you go to hear talks, there's a large portion of focused around this continuous integration, continuous delivery, DevOps space. Okay. So what are they looking for? So in that same study that generated that 65%, these were the top 5 that at the executive level that what they wanted out of implementing some sort of continuous delivery. No surprise that faster time to market was there at the top. A little surprised better product quality was up there, but I would have expected competitive advantage or one of those other ones to be above that, but I love the fact that it's up there. So with that, these are some of the other promises that they're also hearing. So has anybody heard any of these yet? Okay. I love that top one from code change to production in a minute or less. I actually know, if anyone wondering, there's Rally Software, Rally, the tracking software, was speaking with the CEO at Rally Dev in 2014, and he went on and on and on how they go from code change to production in a minute or less. And I was like, oh, I was blown away, that's fantastic. And then I spent a year battling downtime using their application. So, not quite sure if that's a good time, a good thing, or a bad thing yet. But I mean, you can hear the guys from Frontline laughing because they know. You can automate 100% of your testing. Absolutely. Get your devs in there. You can do all your testing with developers. Don't need QA. You can convert CI/CD. You can convert to continuous integration delivery practices in 6 months or less.
Starting from scratch.
Starting from scratch, yeah. And if you're greenfield, probably it's a little bit easier. Quality's improved because you build software in a way that you can be released to production at any time. Just out of curiosity, the people raise their hand, how many are trying to do this on a legacy product? Okay, so the others you're doing this on new development, greenfield. Okay. Yeah, it is much easier to get this out on something new, something greenfield, than it is trying to back into this in legacy.
What do you qualify as a legacy?
Pre-existing, you already have an architectural paradigm, you have it laid down, it's in production, you've previously deployed for a period of time.
Yeah, so we're definitely.
Yep. Yep.
Well, sometimes when you say legacy, people talk mainframe.
Oh, no.
Things like that. That's,
yeah. No, but if somebody figures out how to do continuous delivery for mainframe, love it. I'd attend that talk.
mainframe already has to build it inside. I'm not a mainframe developer, but there's so much built into that.
That's great. Well, after all those years, it probably is.
Yeah.
Okay. So why does this matter? All this and the stuff we covered about drivers and all that. The software testing professionals, we have the ability to really be key communicators, key implementers of how they do this, influencers. And really to do that, you need to understand what is driving business down that route? I've heard everything from extreme pushback to, oh no, we're never going to do this, I don't want to do this, that's scary, never, not in our shop, to, yeah, let's go, how do we do this, let's start rolling, let's start implementing it. But the key is really just, what's behind those business drivers? What's really driving people to do that, to really want to push for it? And I think that more and more, the more and more we strive to understand that, the better we're going to be able to help implement this in our company. Sorry, I had my speaker notes cut off here, and there was something at the bottom I wanted to see. All right. So here's the other thing we got out of this, is kind of what I call the next generation of pool wars. I kind of love it when you go to a conference and you go out someplace and you're like, oh, are you Hudson? Are you Jenkins? Are you Team City? Are you using Puppet? Are you Chef? NUnit? Are you TestNG? Do you use nCrunch, Selenium, HP? Keep going and going and going. Oh, do you use Sauce? Are you rolling your own virtual machines? Okay. The flood of emails I get on a regular basis for tools and practices is insane. I just have this like one folder and it's like 400 unread emails of just stuff. This is kind of the one thing that prompted me to start this talk though, is in there you always have this message of here's all you need. Okay, and when you read white papers, it's like, how we solve continuous delivery using Jenkins, how we solve continuous delivery using this. And when you start reading that, it's like, great for your environment, but we're nothing like you. And then you read somebody else's, and theirs is completely different. It's like, we're nothing like you. And you never get to the point where you stop and you go, oh, I now understand what's behind it, so I can apply the right tools to get the job done. So that's kind of what kind of drove this was that need to make that shift, to turn it on its side, say, put the tools aside. What am I trying to figure out? What is the problem? Okay, because you're not going to find it there. Okay, so a little bit 3 C's of CD. These are unofficial, or at least one of them is. Continuous delivery definition. You can go find that on. Just Google it. You'll probably get that same exact one. All right, integration. So just there, as a room, are we comfortable with the difference between delivery and integration? I see heads nodding, and they're not. All right, third one I really wanted to lobby to is continuous testing. You've heard people throwing this around, but frankly, I'd love to see them try to do the other two without this one, because you're just deploying really crappy code really fast. And continuous testing is really, how do you counter, or how do you keep things fresh and validated through the continuous integration and delivery process? How do you know along the way that things are healthy and going? It leads me to this, which is, in order to start solving it, when does delivery start? Anyone want to take a guess? Take a stab at it? When we talk about continuous delivery, when does it start? Starts at development, somebody's changing code. Yeah, that's one of the answers. I've heard other people say it kind of starts when somebody does the first merger check-in, when somebody does a commit. But it's kind of it's an important question, and it's kind of a loaded question, because the answer is, it kind of depends. It depends on how you're set up. But you need to go there if your organization is doing it. You need to understand what's the difference between I'm just working on something and we're doing a delivery, a deployment of it. Another way of looking at it is if you just look at branching models. So for those GitHubs, this is a simplified version for those that are using Git in the room. But this is kind of a feature branch model where you have the master going out.
I had stuff pointed out and we didn't know, turn it off on for 1,000 times, and turn it off and it didn't come back on.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until it was out there we found that out.
Yep. And that's kind of where I was going with the validate successful deployment now and in the future. It's like, where before the sphere of responsibility was kind of like, we do our feature, we had our product, we pushed it out there, we're done, hey, celebrate everyone, we had a release. Now that CI world is working with smaller and smaller independent packages and smaller units. And a lot of teams are taking larger products and trying to break them into smaller boxes, putting boxes around pieces of functionality and better defining more and more services. So they're actually starting to fracture applications up. And the more and more they fracture that, the less cross-pollination you have with people working on service to service, or front-end person may have no idea what these three service teams are actually doing. So, you don't really get that big end picture. You have to send your deliverable out there prepared to self-test itself in the big picture. Okay. So, key distinction. I wasn't sure whether or not to put this in, but I couldn't help myself. So, testing. Someone want to define testing? That's a rumor, QA people, come on. I thought they did. Even the frontline guys, come on.
I was trying to pull back and over you went.
No, I should put it up there. So what we're talking about is we're talking about the difference between checking and validation and testing. And as you start going down CI/CD, this actually becomes more important. It's a thought pattern. Am I testing something, or am I just checking, validating something? All right, so in Frontline, we actually push this pretty hard. It's just one of those things. I'd love to put up a quarter jar every time somebody misuses it, and they can throw like a quarter in a jar there. But for me, testing is the art of active discovery, elaboration, and exploration and evaluation. All right, you're actively evaluating whether something is good. You're making a decision based on what you're taking in based on your experience. All right, it's experimentation. All right, critical thinking, the what if type scenarios, application of logic, intuition, gut. All right, but basically the end result there is to evaluate if it's good. All right, and then you have checking and validation. Now, I'm not saying you can't use automated tools to help you do testing, but I'm saying when you are using automated tools and things like unit testing or API automation or UI automation, are you actually really testing when you're running the regression? You're checking. Yeah, it's a big checklist. Is it good? Yes. Is it good? Yes. Is it good? Yes. I mean, the software itself has no capability to actually evaluate what's on screen. So when we start going here, this is all about tools and checking and things that do checking, but we need to still figure out how to fit testing into CI and CD. Okay? So the reason why I'm calling that out is not because I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on it. That's a whole different talk. But as you start going down the CI/CD route, and people are like, oh, you need to put this tool in or that tool in, or use this, or you need to test it this layer, and we're going to automate. That voice for we still need to test. Real, quality, hardcore, get in there and test still needs to be part of your process. We're going to call this out. I have a buddy that works at Microsoft, part of the Visual Studio team. He's part of the NuGet package delivery team. He's product owner for it. And just heard today how they are having problems because they went 100% developer automation on all the way they handle the NuGet multi-language integration across like VB and all the .NET languages. And it was like, yeah, it's like I'd love to have you come in and just talk to them because they went 100% automation and they've got thousands of tests and the thing is a bloody quality nightmare. He's like, you've got like 4,000 or 5,000 automated tests and the thing just doesn't work. Well, okay, well that's just like, just another thing that just reinforces, yeah, you can do all this automation, but you still got to test. Make time for it, make a place for it. Okay.
Does that creep into when you said they were breaking down the whole Is that part of maybe the reason why they broke it down into small bites? They got so much test routine for every little packet?
It could be, or it could be that like when you start doing a lot of automation, the one thing that happens is you carve very concrete paths through your application, and you get very much, some of them can be standards based. So if you're doing like TDD or DDD, a lot of those are based off of specs or standards. The problem is like once you reach a certain point, the bugs that you really want to find don't adhere to standards. All right, they're not going to go, oh, here's a standard, let me violate it. You know, you're checking that those standards work. What you really want is you want to carve out that space to play between those lines. Okay. So really what it comes down to is for a team to actually pull the trigger and deploy. You know, I've seen a lot of people say, you know, oh, we're doing it, and then like how many people have done it, the hands went down. All right, what prevents you guys from doing that? All right, that's what I summed up as. I don't know if that rings true for you guys or not, but that's the word I associated with it. In order to do this, you got to get the team to have confidence that they can pull that trigger and go. Okay. All right, the team has to trust. All right. You know, it's kind of weird because you start getting into rather than a dev and QA discussion, the minute you cross from CI over to CD, it really becomes a team discussion. I can't stress that enough. But it's the team itself that has to put those effective lightweight layers in place. It's the team that has to invest some percentage of time to make sure it's maintained. The team has to strive to keep the time to change from that feedback loop as short as possible. And probably the most important thing in continuous delivery is other teams now have to trust your work. You know, that's the one people leave out, is like, you know, you can put it out in the world and it's good, but then somebody else picks up your work and it integrates it in with theirs at some application downstream, and, you know, they're cursing you out. That team delivered this, what? All right. So, how do we get there? It's an end-state problem. I kind of like to phrase it. You have to start with asking the question, or even theorizing, going to your team, going, hey, tomorrow we're pushing code, and then wait for the reaction, or push now. All right, because you're going to get all sorts of responses back as to why you can't do that. When you start with the end goal, you know, we start with deploying code, and you start backing into it. You start peeling off those layers, those inhibitors for how do we go from, you know, to actually deploying it. Where I landed was actually asking two key questions, which was, what information does the team need to have confidence, and then when do they need it? I jumped early on this one, but you know, if you were to go back to your teams and just, you know, say, deploy your code now, you know, what do you think you hear? Oh, what was that? Wait, right? You know, so you know, it's not tested, it's not ready. But where does that reaction come from? I mean, because it might be tested. I mean, you've been testing all along, right? So there's something in either the type of testing or how the testing is structured that is preventing you guys from going, yeah, okay, go ahead. Push it out, we're good. All right? And when I talk about being a mindset shift, that's kind of like one of that thought patterns you need to go back. It's like, actually ask the question. You know, we're going to do this and get that feedback. So, talking about feedback loops and testing. So, you know, what is feedback? It's information. Right? You know, start talking about loops. I actually love the way this is defined. It's a structure, a series, or process for which the end is connected back to the beginning. So when we think about about testing and how one test cycle influences the next test cycle or sprint cycle. Very relevant. All right, so feedback loop is a structure or system structure that causes the output from one node to eventually influence the input of that node. So it loops back on itself. All right. All right. So when we start talking about that, we start getting into types of testing. And would people agree that that's a true statement? No single type of testing covers all the possible information you need to gather and have a team to have confidence? Fairly true? Okay. All right, so what are as the only automated testing on the projects? Wow, not a single hand, that's awesome. I was actually expecting a lot of hands. That's really cool. It means the industry's changing, because I think you asked that question like 5-6 years ago and you would have had a whole bunch of hands up. And actually that's pretty important, because when you start talking about bridging the gap from continuous integration to continuous deployment, continuous delivery, that time to feedback line starts to matter. Right? And when you start talking about time to feedback, different types of tests have different benefits over other, and you just need to know what you have and how to weigh them against each other. So this is actually from a couple of small projects that I went and pulled earlier in the month. But we have one build that's in there running just 8-5-minute test, but it's like less than 9 seconds to run. Okay. And I was trying to find like numbers going through here. We have another part of that same team, same build step. They have API tests that are checking the signature. That's 300 seconds or about 5 minutes to run. That's not bad. All right. Start getting into UI automation. So there's 95 front-end automated test lines. All right. Their time to feedback loop on that right now is 40 minutes. All right. And then when you start factoring in manual testing, I mean that's minutes or days. You start getting into performance testing, that's days to weeks. But it starts really talking about some of the dark side of automation. I'm going to pick on UI automation because I had planned to. Apparently, you guys figured that out already. But it's great for validating workflows. It's great to help build confidence, allow teams to stay focused on the main thing, to be used to assist during testing. But it also has costs. It can become a maintenance nightmare. Your framework's set up wrong, somebody makes a change, you're there for weeks trying to patch it back together, and your team's yelling at you going, well, we need our test to deploy. Yeah, getting there. They can become bloated, slow, and ineffective. So the more and more you add, the longer it takes to run. Quickly loses its value with all that in play and actually get in the way of productivity. Especially if it starts getting abused. So just take a look at a different scenario. And I'm going to actually admit to causing this problem there at the bottom. So we actually have a team in a product that has 2,700 automated scripts. It's a huge application, enterprise web application. At that time, the state of the organization, we had a very anti-unit, anti-any other test type of culture. What we have is fantastic coverage through the front end. But now if we want to deploy anything with that, it's 2,700 plus scripts in 4.5 days running across 22 machines. It's just, that is probably one of the longest automated feedback loops ever. It's like, all right, I pushed a change, all right, get back to you in 4.5 days.
Still less than 2 weeks for
It's not a 2-week sprint, that is true. That's true. We can run it, what, 3 times inside the 2-week sprint if we wanted to. And, last minute changes there are fun. All right. But really, that's just not to, when you're looking at layers and how you approach layers, and this is inside of the test cycle and also when you start sending this thing out to the wild down the deployment line. That time to feedback for the team actually matters. It matters tremendously. You latched onto this real early, is that the earliest thing you can do from a feedback perspective, from a test perspective, regardless whether you're doing CI/CD, is preemptive. User story development, grooming, getting in there and actually putting out test criteria, test ideation into there ahead of time is fantastic, because it changes the developer's mindset. And they actually start thinking about your tests while they're writing code versus the way they like to write their code and how they want to solve it.
To me, that's a bigger, as much of a holy grail than as it is continuous delivery.
I would much rather have a team excel at doing that than continuous delivery. One of the things, I don't mind sharing this, when I coach, when I have the Agile hat on, I'm actually coaching teams, and we're in there, they're doing backlog, they're doing their user story preparation, and they're doing some look ahead and some grooming. The one thing I hate is, you get developers in a room and they're talking about how to solve it. And so often you get to like QA, and it's like, QA, what do I do? 6 hours. You need 6 hours. 6 hours, 6 hours to do what? How about we're going to be checking this, we want to test this, this is a risk. We're going to have this risk area here. So, it's one of that preemptive is probably the shortest and best feedback loop you could ever put into place. But then, as you start going down, those loops get longer and longer and longer and longer. And eventually you get to manual testing, which, really that can go on as for days, weeks, months, depending on what the feature is. But it's really just a quick way to visualize the actual concept of a loop going back to each of them. But then you take that and you invert it, and you start looking at, what's the value of feedback. At the unit and integration test level, you've got fast execution and you have the shortest feedback loop. Just a call out here, does anybody have developers that are using a tool like a continuous unit testing runner like Crunch? Okay. Is anyone familiar or heard of Crunch? All right, one person. All right, it's actually a really, really cool tool, and it's probably the only plug I have tool-wise to bring back. Crunch sits on top of whatever unit test harness you're using, and this is, I know that they have it for .NET Stack. I don't know, I know there's some companion tool, I just don't know the name for it for Java and other stacks. But the minute the developer starts coding, he takes 2 threads or cores, takes a percentage of their processor, and starts running the unit test real time as he's coding. So he changes the line of code, his tests start failing red as he's coding. As he fixes his code, they turn back green. Okay? So, when you think about continuous testing, that's about as close to writing code with an automation solution as you can get. Okay. All right, so you get to JavaScript unit tests. So, familiarity with JavaScript unit testing, Karma, Jasmine. Okay. So, not quite as fast as Unit. You just have to do some sort of deployment. It can run on a headless browser, it can run on a local machine, but it's worthwhile investing in that loop over some of the downstream UI automation because it's a faster check. You can get through more of the structured page layout checks than you would waiting for an end-to-end test run. Very worthwhile investing heavily in that layer. Then you get to the API. We use a tool called Frisbee.js to run our API tests. It's lightweight, runs on Node, high degree of parallelism. SmartBear has a tool out there, SoapUI Toolkit. But this is actually an important layer because it does 2 things. Actually just before I go too far down there, a lot of teams using services, services, and development.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you guys doing API testing? Okay. So when you talk about continuous delivery, this is the thing that leads with your contract. Is my contract good? Is my, am I what you expect me to be to everybody else? We're at a couple of conferences where a lot of people are talking about this being not a valuable layer because there's not a whole lot of tests you can write against them. And, strongly counter that as in it's actually one of the more important layers you can write. You may have 10 or 15 tests in that layer, but that is the thing that always makes sure that your handshake to everybody else is your handshake and contract with everyone else. Okay? But then you start getting into the slower, more delayed execution loops. So you start getting into functional UI tests. You know, you have to deploy them, you have to start them up, run them in parallel, or however it is, and do it. It takes hours or hours to run through a suite, depending on how large it is, you know, performance and so on and so on. You know, the point there is not that, you know, you should stop doing all your UI testing and API testing and just write everything as a unit test. The point that this one and the previous slide we're going for is it actually needs to be a team choice and decision. You guys actually need to have that hard conversation of, you know, here's what you guys built, great. I'm going to be able to test here, and I'm going to be able to provide an end-to-end solution. And I can do 2 or 3 of these, but, you know, the minute I start getting past there, you start getting into longer execution time. What are you guys covering from the development side? Or can we help cover this from an API side? You know, there's often a penchant for teams even to start misusing and abusing layers. Oh, you know, I didn't want to do this from a unit test, and can I write end-to-end API tests? And they'll write these like API tests that go out and they call and they set up data, and then they'll go get a token back, and then they'll run this case and this case and this case and string them along. Why? You know, just move them up where the test should be. Keep those layers light. Favor those short, fast-running tests where possible. Let them do the heavy lifting. You know, that's what it's about. It's about getting them to do the heavy lifting.
I have a question.
Sure.
So at the very top, we talked a little bit about test-driven development. Using, I think you said Enterprise. Was that the name of it?
For that was a unit test runner.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but it was a test-driven development. You say the developers, they're writing the code, they can see it pass or fail. And who would develop that test? Would just the developer write some tests and start writing code against it? How do they even know the test, the development they're doing is against the correct test? They could be just.
Yeah. So you
I
get.
mean, it doesn't even match the requirement of application. That could be even a wrong path, writing excellent code.
Sure. So I mean, at that point, you get down 2 sides there. So one, you have all, if they're on a project for an extended period of time, they have all the tests that they previously had written. And then you have any of the new development being done. And depending if they're in a TDD school of thought,
Right.
they will pre-write out failing test cases. And then as they write the code, watch them pass as they solve the solution.
So in that ATTD framework of thought, they would write unit tests. Okay.
Yep.
Not like integration tests.
Not integration tests or.
Or,
yeah.
whatever that API
Yeah.
areas or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of people
It actually depends. It depends on what industry you are in. You could have, in some of the industries, for example, media industry, we have a developer, and at the same time we have a software tester who is like a developer, who would write the functional tests side by side. So in the TDD approach which we have, we would write the functional test first, right? And then, of course, the first unit test itself, the functional test will fail. So you build it towards the functional test, and as you build it on, you keep on, rerunning the functional test. That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, and there's a balance there too. So if, for example, you're talking about running front-end tests back there, or they were actually truly running like unit tests, systems tests.
You could, right? Like the experience which I have is the developers would write their code in Java, for example, right? And the function test is actually written in Python purposely because you don't want to write it in Java, right? So you would build it based on a feature and say, okay, is all the units built up for this feature? So there's a unit level testing and also there's a functional overall testing, like an integration of function testing.
Yeah, and the key there is keeping it in balance, because a lot of times when you get in down the TDD, BD route, the first school of thought is, oh, we'll wire this up to Selenium, we'll wire this up to some other UI testing, and we'll just write them all there. And then we'll watch those fail. But if you think about it, when you take that and you put that into a CI/CD framework, that shifts. You don't have the luxury of running those all from the front end. You need to take that and shift that to something higher up the stack.
Right, so the paradigm I was talking about is most dev shops I would have been part of, the developers either feel obligated or they're obligated to write code coverage. They write unit tests. And generally they write it after they wrote the code. But you do run into problems where those tests are as invalid as the code that they're currently
Oh, sure, you could write hundreds of invalid unit tests.
Right.
Like, there's software out there that will generate hundreds of invalid unit tests for you to push of a button.
Right. So in your process of implementing ATDD, I'm trying to figure out what is the best thing to do. Is writing code coverage test even a good idea? It seems a bit silly to me. If you can write tests to test behavior, the function right up front, and getting developers involved in doing that rather than.
Yeah, one of I tell you the way that we've been approaching it has been because our developers don't want to write coverage things. It's not about a number. You can gain the coverage numbers as very, very easy. You want 80% coverage? Sure, I get you that in 5 minutes. And maybe that's just part of our culture, but they actually spend a lot of time just focusing on what is the primary business logic. And they want to make sure, so they take a business logic approach to it, and what is the core capability of what this needs to do? How do we make sure this is protected? Starting to have more and more conversations with QA on how would you test that? What are you going to cover? How do we need to block? What do you want covered here so you don't have to write a UI test down the road? So I think the catalyst for that for us was that dialogue. It was no longer these are the tests that you write and these are the tests that we write. It was these are the tests that the team needs to write to ship this thing off. So it was that conversation.
But that takes a level of maturity that takes over time.
That level of maturity took 2+ years to cultivate. Just being honest, that was.
No, that
John,
makes
is that
sense.
wrong? When did I get on that soapbox?
2 years.
That was about 2 years ago, and that was a soapbox. I carried that soapbox around with me, and I just still do. But it really is like you got to talk because we're wasting this time building this, and you can take an hour to do that, and we want to make sure I'm not going to do that. Is not this soapbox. I'll bring that some other day. But yeah, it was